Hi everyone, welcome back. This is going to be videos 5 and 6. The first is going to be a short overview of the course topics, and the second will be a little bit about the topic of what is government. That's very basic to even starting with the course. So I will get started with the course overview and then move on. So first of all, I want to tell you what my number one single most important goal for this course is. I don't expect you to become experts. I do want you to understand the basics of American government and politics so that you can be an informed global citizen. And so that you have a better understanding of why U.S. government may do things that seem odd to you. Whether you live here, whether you live elsewhere. Um, the U.S. government does things that sometimes seem odd to its own citizens and certainly seem odd to people whose systems of government are somewhat different than ours. So my goal is to help you understand those things. Um, I'm going to cover the three branches of government in the United States and Texas. So those are Congress, the president, and the courts, or the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary at the federal level. And then at the state level in Texas, we also have the legislative, executive, and judiciary. This in itself is not necessarily greatly different from other governments. Around the world, but some of the way we split things up is. Um, Second, I'm going to cover ethics and government. So ethics, uh, starting with just some basic ideas of ethics, so that we know what I'm talking about, um, and then applying it to the three branches specifically, and government in general. And then finally, at the end, talking about the ethics of what it means to be a good citizen in a democracy or a republic. Um, and that is not unique to the United States. While I'll talk about it in the context of the U.S., the idea of the ethics of citizenship and the ethics of voting is something that I think crosses national borders in terms of thinking about what it means to be a good citizen. And then we'll also do an overview of some things to do with policy. And again, I'll talk about them mostly in the U.S. perspective, although some of them will be international policies that affect other countries. Um, but again, my goal is to talk about what makes good policy, how we judge policy, as citizens, what we should expect from our governments in terms of policy. And again, this is not limited to the U.S. perspective. So, the three branches of government in the U.S. and Texas, we will start off by talking about the U.S. Congress and the Texas legislature. So these are the same thing. These are the legislative branch at two different levels. Then we'll talk about the presidency and the federal bureaucracy, and Texas's version, which is the plural executive. So we don't have a president, we have a governor, but we also have several other elected executive officials, which is different than the federal level. Then we'll talk about the federal courts, that's the national courts, and the Texas courts. And finally, I'll talk about local government. And while I'm talking about this, I'm also going to talk about the difference. Why is it that we have a U.S. Congress and a Texas legislature, not just one that covers the whole country? Why do we have a president and a governor? Is the president appointed by the governor? And the answer is no. The Texas government is elected in its own right. And so the sovereignty is split in what we call a federalist system. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Um, I will talk, like I said, about ethics in government. And then when we get to the policy overview, I'm going to talk about public finance. I'm going to talk about economic policy, social policy, criminal justice, foreign policy. And I think I left out environmental policy. So there will be some environmental policy in there too. The big things I'm going to talk about are things like how do we make decisions when there are trade-offs? How do we tell what's a good policy, what's a bad policy? What kind of standards should we apply to policy? Things like that. Not necessarily to tell you this is how it should be, but to give you some ideas for how to start to make critical judgments for yourself. Um, Ethics in government. Sorry, I guess I got this out of order, but um, talk about general ethics as it relates to government. I'll talk about congressional ethics. So just federal level. I'm not going to talk about anything relating to Texas. Executive branch ethics. So that will cover the president, the vice president, and the federal bureaucracy. And then judicial ethics. So the ethics of judges, of the federal judges and the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. And then finally, ethics in the citizen, which will be focused a lot on voting. So that's where the course is going. Hopefully that wasn't too long, so you can take a break, and when you're ready, come back for a slightly longer video on the topic of what is government.